Jesus, beloved, or swine of the earth eternal? Ooh, scary. So the Dead Sea Scrolls. This is part of what gets confusing about carbon dating. The oldest of the books of the Bible, according to carbon dating, is the book of Judas Iscariot. Yeah. Nearly all of the books of the Bible that we have were written in later dates. Some say they were transcripts. Some say that they were writings that were done by scribes and were orally dictated to these scribes. So you can see, even in the Dead Sea Scrolls, how many of the books that are in the Bible, the older ones and the terminology used in them is different than the newer ones. The newer it is, the more likely it is that words have been changed in it or have been differently interpreted by later generations based upon what is popular with political ideology. Some of the first Protestants ever burned at the stake were burned at the stake because they had a vote. Who's they? The Catholic Church. All these different religious groups came together, all sorts of different Christian groups. There was no such thing as Catholicism. You were either Christian or you weren't, but there were many different views on how to view Christ. Some of the Dead Sea Scrolls were found in the Dead Sea, and they're named for the Dead Sea, which is where the first ones were found. But the Dead Sea is not the only place that they were found. There's a man in Chapel, Nebraska, Native American feller, Christian. He's also disabled. He and I have had many a discussion on theology. We've also had discussions on the books themselves. When he's telling me about a sheep farmer who got his foot in a hole and there was a Dead Sea Scroll in it, and that's where all the Dead Sea Scrolls come from, he's partially right. He's partially right. I believe it was 1967 when the first major cache from the Dead Sea Scrolls was found. Now, according to carbon dating, the oldest of the Dead Sea Scrolls actually predates Jesus himself by about 200 years. That's the book of Judas Iscariot. That's what shows us that carbon dating is not 100% accurate, obviously. Now, how do they carbon date the thing? They incinerate it. No, they don't have to incinerate the entire document. They only have to incinerate a tiny portion. Now, that doesn't mean that these books were written before Jesus was alive. How could they have been? How could Judas Iscariot have written it hundreds of years before Jesus was alive? Was Judas Iscariot some sort of immortal? No. And if you've read the book of Judas, you know this. He was a common man of common people. And like every Jew of his generation, they all had a rabbi. Every Jew had a rabbi. Every Jew. Every single one. You had a rabbi that you went to. Your local block in the city might have up to a dozen rabbi. Rabbi means teacher. And the Bible was their educational book, although it wasn't the Bible at the time, it was the Torah. The first books of the Bible. It might be interesting for you to know that Jesus himself didn't write a single thing in the Bible. All of it was written by the disciples, their Gospels. Even though the Muslims have the Book of Mary, that's right, Jesus' own mother has an entire book in her name in the Quran. How many of you know that? How many of you care? Now, why is the book of Judas Iscariot so important? Because it's the only book that makes any sense out of any of it. I believe it was John, having to write from prison at 80 years old, blind, was able to write his experience about his long-lost friend, the fond memories that he had of his long-lost teacher. At that age, he might have been going senile for all we know. None of the books, not one Dead Sea Scroll other than the book of Judas Iscariot, could have been written in Jesus' lifetime. Not one. Not a single one. Now, just because we have one book of Judas that predates the birth of Christ according to carbon dating, doesn't mean that it was written by Judas. To my knowledge, Judas would not have had access to learn the Greek language. And the book of Judas is written in an ancient Greek dialect. So, obviously, the sect of Christianity that was trying to push the book of Judas Iscariot to have it put into the Bible when it was voted on what was going into the Bible. A lot of Catholics thought, well, you know, we have to paint Jesus as this perfect savior, and we must have a villain. And Judas Iscariot fits the part. According to the book of Judas, however, Judas Iscariot was aware of this. Jesus told him that his name would be cursed for generations. Jesus told Judas, "You are the most trusted of my disciples." The first martyrs, the first Protestant martyrs, were Greeks who tried to have the book of Judas put in the Bible. Moral of the story: you'll murder each other over the way people think. Of course, I don't follow Christianity. I study it. The same as I studied Mein Kampf. How best to combat a madman, but to know how he thinks. The things that Joseph Michael Lopez was into, I've had a lot of influences in my life who were into those very same things. People like Christopher Stegeman. People like Joshua Hebert. I've known a lot of sick shits in my life. Now let's get back to Jeff Baldridge. Jeff Baldridge looked up what I was telling him about the Dead Sea Scrolls. Not the Book of Judas or any of that, just the Dead Sea Scrolls. But he looked it up. And he told me that I was right and that he was wrong. The reality is, he wasn't wrong. He was just wrong about one part. Not all of the Dead Sea Scrolls came from the Dead Sea. Some of them came from Cyprus. Some of them came from Spain. That's right. Some of them were hundreds of years after Jesus was killed. Hundreds of years. Now, even the book of Judas Iscariot, since it probably was not written by Judas, it was probably written by someone else reading a transcript who had heard the story, or, well, many other possibilities, aren't there? We can't verify any of the books of the Bible. We can verify that they were written down on paper, but we have no way of verifying if John the Baptist actually wrote that story or if it was someone later in life. We don't know how much of an impact people like Paul or Saul had on what's in the Bible, or how much their influence within the church or their infighting with Jesus' actual disciples, how much it actually had to do with it. Paul is given credit for being the savior of Christianity. He did not know Jesus. He never met Jesus. Yet, he was able to abuse the political climate at the time and change just enough of Jesus' words to fit and suit his fancy, to get people to actually pursue those who actually walked with Jesus. I don't mean pursuing them for their knowledge. I mean pursuing them to shut them up, to lock them up. Was it John, who was 80 years old, writing his rendition of the Bible, his gospel, from within a prison? Mind you, this man was blind. Thinking back fondly of those in his youth, like a football player. The only thing he ever did in his life that anybody gave him real recognition for is blocking a punt back in high school. What's he gonna write about to leave some portion of legacy of his life? His loved ones? Or that day at the football game? Judas Iscariot. I like his story. I like the book. Now there's different renditions of it. One of the other copies is written a little bit differently. That's what happens. You lose stuff in translation. When you hear something and then you try to orally orate it to someone else, they might write it down in shorthand and you miss stuff. Or they might just jot down some notes and try to mostly remember it as best they can. But none of the Bible makes sense. None of the New Testament makes any sense whatsoever without the book of Judas Iscariot. None of it. With the book of Judas, that sews the whole thing together, but there's so many contradictions in the Bible already. John, Mark, and Luke all had different renditions of the exact same events. Entirely different ideas of what happened for events they were all there for and all saw with their own two eyes. None of the Dead Sea Scrolls, including the book of Judas, not a single one of them, not even one, was handwritten by one of the 12 apostles. Not a single one. We have only transcripts. We have primary orations written down long after the fact. This is how the Romans did things. They would change things according to modern rules. the modern terminology and the modern use by the common people. One of the reasons for speaking in Latin and reading and orating in Latin was that the common people weren't allowed to know Latin. So when they went to Mass and they went to prayer, it was all Greek to them. I like the Bible. It's a good book. My favorite character of any book ever written is Jesus. Because I thought he was a good man, not because he was the Son of God. Even Judas and I disagree on that. In the book of Judas, well, I agree with a lot of what's in it, but there's also some hoopla that comes from later politics. And of course, people want to discredit the book of Judas because the copy that we have that might have possibly been written by Josephus himself. If any of y'all know about Roman history or the history of Judea, then you guys know quite a bit about a lot of different characters from the Bible. Pontius Pilate, Emperor Nero. It's not just a little tiny area with just a few people. The Siege of Masada, 70 AD. The Siege of Masada wasn't that long after Jesus' death. We're talking about within 40 years of his death. So people at Masada, there may have been people at Masada who were alive to hear Jesus himself speak. According to the Bible, there were a lot of people who showed up to listen to Jesus speak. There's also the life expectancy of somebody from Judea at the time, which is about 27 years old. 27. That is significant. Romans didn't live much longer than that. Roman doctors would often tell their patients, if you get a cut or a scratch, don't go to the public baths. It'll fester and you will fucking die. And it was true. It was absolutely true. We want to talk about how clean the Romans were. No, they were absolutely filthy. You could get a venereal disease from using the toilets back then easily, because everybody wiped their crack with a sponge on a stick. Everyone. Their toilets were specifically designed so that you could use your clothing to cover up all your parts while you squat and shat. What's all this got to do with Judas? Well, at the time, Judas Iscariot, Jesus himself, all of his disciples were living in a Roman province. Roman! The Romans were quite tolerant of other religions, contrary to popular belief. Their complete and total disdain for any other religions other than their own started with Constantine, who never actually converted to Christianity. Matter of fact, the church that he had constructed, he filled with statues and images of the old Roman gods, wood nymphs. Zeus himself even had a statue there. Hermes. Constantine was a heartless bastard and a mean son of a bitch who converted to Christianity because he saw the political climate. He saw that, well, the Christians That's the poor people's religion. And the poor people, they're the majority of the population. If you don't want the poor people to rise up, then you better play like you're on their side and get their support. Prior to Constantine, the Praetorian Guard got to choose who the emperor was, regardless of the Senate, regardless of the people. It's too bad we keep following those same politics today. It's too bad we didn't learn the lesson from the Romans and their failed republic, or the Greeks and their failed democracy. There was only ever one true democracy to exist in the history of humankind. And that piracy in the Caribbean prior to the 1720s, or partially during the 1720s. The golden age of piracy was the only era where democracy ever existed in written history. The only time true democracy ever reared its beautiful head. And those pirates, and literacy about those pirates, including the great Blackbeard, are what helped to fuel the fire and the flames of the United States and our revolution. Piracy. Not the Greeks, not the Jesus, not even Judas Iscariot. It was a bunch of filthy, nasty, sweaty, stinky, below decks type of folks. Without so much as a footlocker. Those at the bottom got tired of being walked on. They said, screw your wages, I'll take my freedom. And what did they do? They took their freedom. They took it by force. We don't work for you no more. We're working for ourselves. Leave us alone. If you can't do that, well, everyone you send our way, we'll make sure are dealt with swiftly and justly. Leave us alone. The survivors of Queen Anne's War, same as Judas Iscariot, got to be your patsy. The only Dead Sea Scroll that we found that could have been written in Jesus' lifetime, by someone who was alive in Jesus' lifetime, is the book of Judas. Which version? The one that's supposed to be 200 years older than Jesus? Or the one that's written in a Greek dialect, possibly by Josephus? Why would Josephus write it in a Greek dialect instead of in Hebrew? Well, that's a political debate and a historical debate for another time. I talk in religion, least of all yours. None of you are right. We're all wrong. We'll consider that a win.